Amid the vast theater of World War II, few events within the German military establishment embodied as much internal dissent as Operation Valkyrie. Designed as an emergency continuity of government plan in case of internal unrest, Valkyrie would ultimately be repurposed by a faction of Wehrmacht officers for a far more subversive objective: the assassination of Adolf Hitler and the overthrow of the Nazi regime. To understand how such a plot could develop within one of the most tightly controlled dictatorships in modern history, one must first examine the shifting landscape of the Third Reich, both externally on the battlefield and internally within its power structures. By the midpoint of the war, Germany's early string of victories had turned into a grueling war of attrition. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 had stretched German resources to the limit, and the disastrous defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 shattered the illusion of invincibility that had surrounded Hitler's military strategy. The cumulative cost in lives, material, and morale signaled a broader strategic failure. At home, Germany was under constant aerial bombardment, its cities ravaged by Allied raids, and its economy strained under the weight of total war. Civilian sentiment, once fervently nationalistic, began to erode in the face of hardship and rising casualties. Within the ranks of the German army, some officers, many of whom had served long before the rise of the Nazis, grew increasingly disillusioned with Hitler's erratic leadership. The purging of the Wehrmacht's high command, the SS's encroachment on military autonomy, and Hitler's refusal to heed strategic counsel led many to view him not only as a threat to Germany's survival, but as the principal architect of its impending ruin. While some were motivated by pragmatism, others were guided by moral objections to the regime's crimes, including the persecution of Jews and the conduct of the war in the East. The structure of the German state provided little room for lawful dissent. Opposition movements were fragmented, heavily surveilled, and often brutally suppressed. Yet, despite the risks, a number of military officers, diplomats, and civil servants began to form clandestine circles of resistance. Figures such as Colonel General Ludwig Beck, former chief of the General Staff, and Karl Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, emerged as key political voices in the opposition. Their efforts focused on removing Hitler and replacing the Nazi regime with a provisional government that could negotiate peace with the Western Allies. Within this growing circle, the idea emerged to exploit Operation Valkyrie, a plan originally drafted by General Friedrich Olbricht. The plan was intended to ensure continuity in the event of internal unrest, such as a slave labor uprising or coup by foreign workers. Crucially, the plan gave the Reserve Army the authority to assume control of civil administration in case of emergency, with orders pre-written for rapid implementation. The conspirators intended to manipulate the plan's protocols, assassinate Hitler, declare a state of emergency, and use Valkyrie's legal framework to neutralize the SS and seize key government positions before the Nazi leadership could respond. The decision to proceed with this approach was not reached overnight. The internal dynamics of the resistance were fraught with hesitation, ideological disagreements, and strategic uncertainty. Earlier attempts to assassinate Hitler had failed or been aborted, often due to timing or lack of access. The dictator was heavily guarded, constantly relocating, and surrounded by layers of security that defied conventional attacks. Moreover, success would hinge not only on killing Hitler, but on seizing control of Berlin and the German communication infrastructure within hours, a tall order for a handful of scattered plotters under surveillance. Still, the conspirators were undeterred. They believed that the tide of war had created an opening, both militarily and politically. Hitler's declining health and growing isolation from his generals gave them hope that the plan could be executed while sowing confusion among his loyalists. More importantly, the impending collapse of the Eastern Front, coupled with the Allied invasion of France in June 1944, created a sense of urgency. A narrow window had opened in which an internal coup might prompt a negotiated peace with Britain and the United States, forestalling the complete destruction of Germany. Into this volatile landscape stepped Klaus von Stauffenberg, a young aristocratic officer who had been severely wounded in North Africa, losing his right hand, 2 fingers on his left, and an eye. A devout Catholic with strong patriotic convictions, Stauffenberg became the central operational figure in the plot. His resolve, charisma, and access to Hitler's inner circle through his role in the Reserve Army made him uniquely suited for the task. With the backing of Beck, Ulbricht, and others, he would become the man tasked with carrying the bomb into Hitler's war conference room. The plan that would unfold in July 1944 was the culmination of years of ideological resistance, logistical preparation, and personal sacrifice. But it was also riddled with danger and uncertainty. The story of Operation Valkyrie would soon transition from whispered plans and theoretical drafts to one of the most daring acts of military insurrection in the history of the Second World War. The operational machinery behind the Valkyrie plot began to take definitive shape in early 1944. At its core was the manipulation of existing emergency protocols within the German Reserve Army, allowing the conspirators to leverage legal structures to execute a coup. General Friedrich Ulbricht, who worked within the General Army Office, held the authority to initiate Operation Valkyrie under the pretext of internal disorder. His position allowed him to revise the plan's documentation, inserting new orders that would, upon activation, lead military units to seize control of key government facilities, communication centers, and arrest SS and Nazi officials, all under the guise of restoring order following a supposed insurrection. Crucially, these orders were already written, duplicated, and stored in safes across military offices. The challenge lay in aligning their activation with Hitler's death. If the Führer survived the attempt, the entire operation would collapse. The SS would retaliate with overwhelming force, and the conspirators would be exposed. Thus, the plan hinged on the precise coordination of the assassination and the subsequent triggering of Valkyrie. Timing, secrecy, and discipline were paramount. Klaus von Stauffenberg's rise to operational leadership coincided with growing desperation within the resistance. He had access to Hitler's military briefings at the Wolf's Lair, the Führer's heavily fortified headquarters in East Prussia. Though severely handicapped from his war injuries, Stauffenberg's determination and presence of mind enabled him to carry a briefcase bomb and arm it within the constraints of his physical limitations. His rank of Chief of Staff to General Fromm, head of the Reserve Army, offered a direct line to both Hitler and the apparatus required to enact Valkyrie. Stauffenberg's first opportunity arose on July 11, 1944, when he attended a meeting with Hitler, but aborted the plan due to the absence of other key figures. Killing Hitler alone would not suffice. His death needed to coincide with the neutralization of SS leadership such as Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring. Without eliminating them simultaneously, the regime might regroup and crush the coup. A second attempt was scheduled for July 15th, but was again called off. Despite the increasing pressure, the conspirators hesitated, concerned about the unfavorable setting and presence of too few Nazi leaders. Meanwhile, the plotters in Berlin, Ulbricht, Ludwig Beck, Karl Goerdeler, and others, prepared for immediate action. Communications lines, including the Bendler Block in Berlin, were on standby to issue Valkyrie orders the moment confirmation of Hitler's death arrived. Lists of targets had been drawn, military units pre-positioned, and fake intelligence suggesting SS unrest had been crafted. Several officers, including General Erich Feldgiebel, were positioned at the Wolf's Lair to sever communications and prevent any counter-orders from loyalists. The plot's success required absolute deception. Most Wehrmacht officers outside the conspiracy were expected to obey Valkyrie orders without question, believing they were responding to an SS coup. Only after the Nazi hierarchy had been dismantled would the conspirators announce the true nature of the operation and the establishment of a post-Hitler transitional government. This government, provisionally led by Beck and Goerdeler, aimed to restore the rule of law, negotiate peace with the Allies, and re-establish German dignity free from totalitarianism. On July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg again flew to the Wolf's Lair, this time determined to act. With him, he carried a British-made plastic explosive, a pencil detonator, and a specially modified briefcase. He entered the morning briefing late, where Hitler, his generals, and aides gathered in a wooden hut due to the summer heat. The concrete bunker, originally planned for the meeting, had been deemed too stifling. This single environmental factor, one of many uncontrollable variables, would become critical to the outcome. Before the meeting, Stauffenberg excused himself under the pretext of needing privacy and entered a side room where he activated the pencil fuse. The process took several minutes, and he only managed to arm one of two explosive charges due to time constraints. Carrying the briefcase under his arm, he returned to the conference room, placing it under the table close to Hitler. Moments later, he exited the room under the pretext of a phone call. Shortly thereafter, the bomb detonated. The explosion tore through the room, killing 4 individuals and injuring many others. Stauffenberg, observing the smoke and chaos from a distance, believed Hitler had been killed. He immediately boarded a plane for Berlin, certain that the operation's primary condition had been fulfilled. Messages were sent, and Valkyrie was activated. In Berlin, Ulbricht and others began issuing orders to military units to arrest SS officers and seize control of ministries. But the deception quickly unraveled. Hitler had survived with only minor injuries. His trousers shredded, his eardrums damaged, but very much alive. Loyalists quickly reasserted control, and the slow rollout of Valkyrie orders allowed time for confusion and contradiction to spread. General Fromm, not a conspirator but initially hesitant, reversed his position upon learning that Hitler lived. Arrests began almost immediately. The coup collapsed before nightfall. As news spread through the Wehrmacht and Nazi leadership, the plotters were rounded up with brutal efficiency. That night, in the Bendlerblock courtyard, Stauffenberg and several others were summarily executed by firing squad. The failed coup not only reinforced Hitler's cult of invincibility, but also unleashed a merciless wave of purges across the military and civil service. The consequences would reverberate far beyond the July afternoon. In the immediate aftermath of the failed assassination, the Nazi regime moved with brutal speed and precision. Adolf Hitler, shaken but very much alive, seized upon the event to justify a far-reaching purge of dissent within the military, government, and civilian population. By dawn on July 21st, the Gestapo had already begun compiling arrest lists based on intelligence gathered months prior. These dossiers, which had been passively maintained in surveillance operations, were now activated with lethal intent. What followed was not only a manhunt for the July 20th conspirators, but a systematic eradication of any perceived disloyalty within the ranks of the Reich. General Friedrich Ulbricht, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, and Ludwig Beck were among the first to be apprehended in the Bendlerblock. Beck was offered the opportunity to commit suicide, but failed to inflict a fatal wound. He was then executed by a soldier on Fromm's orders. Fromm, attempting to obscure his own complicity, hastily convened a summary court-martial and had Stauffenberg, Quernheim, Ulbricht, and Werner von Haiften shot that same night. Their executions were carried out in the courtyard, with no formal trial, under floodlights, and with SS guards watching closely. The Gestapo would later arrest Fromm himself, suspecting his knowledge and passivity. He too would be executed in 1945. As days passed, the circle of arrests widened. The regime used the Valkyrie plot as a pretext to eliminate not only the direct conspirators, but also anyone loosely affiliated with the German resistance. By mid-August 1944, over 5,000 individuals had been implicated, many of whom had no direct role in the July 20th events. The People's Court, under the leadership of the notorious Roland Freisler, conducted a series of televised show trials designed more for humiliation and terror than justice. Defendants were mocked, denied defense, and often sentenced to death after brief proceedings. Executions were deliberately cruel. Many were hanged by piano wire, slowly strangled to death, their final moments filmed for Hitler's private viewing. The intention was clear: to make an example of the resistance and eliminate any remaining moral or political opposition within the Wehrmacht and German elite. Among those executed were Karl Goerdeler, a conservative politician slated to become chancellor after Hitler's death; General Erwin von Witzleben, a respected officer and former commander of Army Group D, and Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a theologian who had worked with underground networks and helped Jews escape Germany. While the crackdown continued, the Nazi propaganda machine went into full operation. Joseph Goebbels framed the attempt on Hitler's life as a betrayal of the German people, accusing the conspirators of cowardice and treason. Hitler addressed the nation via radio, presenting himself as the chosen leader protected by divine intervention. He emphasized his survival as proof of his destiny and demanded even greater loyalty. The language of vengeance pervaded public speeches, newsreels, and newspaper articles. National mourning was ordered for the victims of the bomb, and commemorations were staged to honor those who had died defending the Führer. Despite the terror that followed, the July 20th plot exposed deep fractures within the German war effort. High-ranking officers who had once enjoyed relative independence were now under suspicion. The SS expanded its surveillance over the military, and the distinction between military and political command began to blur further. Hitler's paranoia deepened, and he increasingly isolated himself in his headquarters, distrusting even his closest advisors. Strategic decisions grew more erratic, and loyalty tests became common throughout the ranks. The regime's internal tightening came at a time when Germany could least afford it. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were launching Operation Bagration, one of the most devastating offensives of the war. Army Group Center was annihilated, and German positions collapsed across Belarus. In the west, Allied forces were advancing out of Normandy, liberating French cities and closing in on Paris. The disarray within the German High Command, now exacerbated by fear and purges, directly contributed to the degradation of operational cohesion on both fronts. Internationally, the Valkyrie plot was met with cautious interest. The Allies, though encouraged by signs of internal German opposition, were committed to unconditional surrender, and thus unwilling to negotiate with the conspirators, even if the coup had succeeded. Still, foreign leaders took note of the fact that not all Germans supported the Nazi regime. The plot helped shape post-war narratives about the other Germany, a segment of society that had resisted tyranny from within. Perhaps most poignantly, the failure of Operation Valkyrie underscored the immense difficulty of overthrowing a totalitarian regime from within, especially one as surveilled, militarized, and ideologically entrenched as Nazi Germany. The conspirators had failed not because of a lack of courage or planning, but because the machinery of the state was built to crush dissent before it could take form. Their gamble had been bold but desperate, an attempt to redirect the course of a war already spiraling into devastation. With their deaths, Germany lost some of the few voices willing to confront Hitler's vision with action. The collapse of the Valkyrie operation marked a critical psychological and strategic moment for both the German military and its leadership. Though the physical infrastructure of the Nazi regime remained intact, the event exposed an undercurrent of dissent that Hitler had long suspected but never fully contained. In response, he launched a sweeping reorganization of military command, aiming to eradicate not only the perpetrators, but the very conditions that allowed such resistance to form. This entailed the further subjugation of the Wehrmacht to ideological loyalty tests, increased SS influence over military affairs, and the centralization of command in Hitler's own hands. In the days and weeks following July the 20th, security protocols were overhauled. Officers were subjected to renewed scrutiny, and any sign of independent thought or deviation from party lines was grounds for dismissal or arrest. The German army, once a semi-autonomous professional force with traditions rooted in the Prussian military ethic, was now forced into the mold of ideological conformity. Sworn personal oaths of loyalty to Hitler were no longer symbolic. They became tools of political enforcement. Trust was replaced with surveillance. Orders were to be obeyed without question, and field commanders were frequently rotated to prevent the formation of internal allegiances. The inner circle around Hitler also underwent transformation. Martin Bormann, already a powerful bureaucrat, solidified his control over access to the Führer, ensuring that only the most loyal and compliant officers could reach him. Himmler's SS expanded its surveillance and intelligence-gathering operations into military command structures, replacing the traditional counterintelligence services with more politically reliable operatives. This created a climate of fear, where silence became self-preservation, and initiative could be seen as treachery. While the upper echelons of the Wehrmacht were being purged, the effects of the failed coup trickled down to the front lines. In units across Europe and the Eastern Front, soldiers were ordered to reaffirm their loyalty, and unit leaders were required to report any signs of dissent or wavering morale. Military chaplains, educators, and even medical officers were conscripted into ideological enforcement. Propaganda leaflets about the traitors of July 20th were distributed widely, emphasizing the conspirators' aristocratic backgrounds and portraying them as elitist saboteurs who had sought to betray the common soldier. The SS took the opportunity to push a narrative that contrasted the pure National Socialist warrior with the old military caste that had supposedly failed Germany in 1918 and was now doing so again. In Berlin, the Bendler Block, the headquarters where the conspirators had coordinated the Valkyrie plan, was turned into a site of political theater. The courtyard where Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators were executed was deliberately left visible, with guards posted and visitors brought to observe. The space became a grim symbol, intended to dissuade further dissent through implied threat. Yet, paradoxically, it also became, in secret, a site of whispered remembrance for those who believed that the conspirators had acted with honor. Internationally, the Valkyrie plot attracted complex reactions. Allied intelligence services, which had occasionally been in indirect contact with elements of the German resistance prior to July 1944, had adopted a policy of non-engagement, focusing instead on unconditional surrender. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin viewed internal coups with skepticism, concerned that they might lead to negotiated settlements that would leave the Nazi regime, or elements of it, intact. Still, reports of the failed plot were used for psychological warfare. Allied propaganda pointed to the assassination attempt as evidence of Hitler's weakening grip and the internal contradictions within the German system. The failure also affected German diplomatic relations. In occupied countries and neutral states, the plot momentarily reignited hope that the war could be shortened by internal fracture. Resistance groups in France, Poland, the Netherlands, and even within Italy took note, but ultimately recognized that the Nazi regime remained capable of brutal suppression. The consolidation of power that followed July the 20th demonstrated that the German state, even in the midst of military collapse, retained formidable capacity for control. Meanwhile, surviving members of the conspiracy, those not immediately executed, were subjected to prolonged interrogation and torture by the Gestapo. The regime sought not only to punish, but to extract confessions that could implicate broader circles and feed its narrative of internal betrayal. The Berlin detention centers and concentration camps became the final destinations for many who had once walked the corridors of power. Torture, starvation, and staged suicides became common tools used to extract compliance or ensure silence. Operation Valkyrie was over, but its aftermath cast a long shadow. Within the military, the coup attempt accelerated the decline of professionalism and strategic coherence. Command decisions became increasingly political, and Hitler's refusal to tolerate dissent led to disastrous battlefield rigidity. This would be most apparent in the final months of the war, as German forces were ordered to hold indefensible positions, launch suicidal counterattacks, or waste precious resources on symbolic resistance rather than pragmatic withdrawal. As the Third Reich spiraled toward its collapse, the ghost of July the 20th lingered in the margins of official discourse. Though never publicly rehabilitated by the Nazi regime, the memory of the conspirators endured in whispers, in families, and in small acts of defiance. Their actions, though unsuccessful, had revealed a critical truth. Even within one of the most oppressive systems in modern history, there were those who recognized the abyss and chose to act. Their failure sealed their fate, but their legacy would live on in a post-war Germany that would one day reckon with its past. As the German Reich entered its final months, the strategic situation on all fronts deteriorated rapidly. The consequences of July the 20th reverberated not only through the high command, but also in the operational realities faced by German forces. The disintegration of the Wehrmacht's professional integrity, accelerated by the purge of capable commanders suspected of ideological disloyalty, crippled decision-making at critical junctures. Military operations, particularly on the Eastern Front, suffered from increasingly irrational orders issued directly by Hitler, whose distrust of his generals deepened after the failed coup. In the east, Operation Bagration, launched by the Red Army in late June 1944, had already inflicted catastrophic losses on Army Group Center. The destruction of this key formation in Belarus obliterated the German defensive lines and left the Eastern Front in strategic freefall. The Soviet advance, now reaching into Poland and the Baltic states, revealed the growing disparity in operational capability. While the Red Army benefited from superior logistics, manpower, and coordination, German forces were hampered by internal instability, a lack of initiative among commanders, and dwindling reinforcements. The collapse in the East was not only a result of military overreach, but also of the systemic distrust that had paralyzed flexible response. In France, the Allied breakout from Normandy further compounded Germany's strategic collapse. By late August, Paris had been liberated, and the Wehrmacht was in full retreat across Western Europe. Army Group B, under Field Marshal Walter Model, attempted to stabilize the front, but lacked sufficient resources and mobility. The Valkyrie purge had removed several officers capable of adaptive thinking, replacing them with ideologues or passive executors of Hitler's commands. The effect was most visible in the disastrous Arnhem campaign and the futile resistance to Allied advances into Belgium and the Netherlands. What might once have been delaying actions became death traps, with units ordered to hold positions to the last man, regardless of tactical logic. The situation in Italy fared no better. With Allied forces pressing northward and the Italian resistance gaining strength, German troops were stretched thin. The Nazi leadership increasingly relied on brutal reprisals and terror tactics to maintain control, further alienating occupied populations and fueling insurgency. The lack of strategic depth, coupled with a command structure riven by suspicion and centralization, made effective defense nearly impossible. Hitler's refusal to cede any ground transformed every withdrawal into a crisis, and his insistence on personal control delayed responses that could have preserved entire divisions. Within Germany itself, total war had reached a new level of severity. Following the July 20th plot, the regime launched sweeping initiatives to mobilize every available resource. The Volkssturm, a national militia composed of boys, the elderly, and previously unfit civilians, was formed in late 1944 as a desperate measure to bolster defenses. These hastily armed and poorly trained units were expected to stand against seasoned Allied and Soviet formations. The psychological toll was immense, not only for the conscripts themselves, but for a population increasingly aware that defeat was imminent. The economy, already under strain from Allied bombing and labor shortages, was nearing collapse. Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, attempted to maintain industrial output through centralization and the exploitation of forced labor, but even his efforts could not compensate for the logistical breakdowns caused by fuel shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and disrupted transportation networks. The consequences of Hitler's rigidity were now being felt across all sectors, military, economic, and civil. The SS, emboldened by the post-Valkyrie purge, expanded its role in both military operations and domestic security. Heinrich Himmler, now entrusted with more authority, directed the use of concentration camp labor for weapons production and oversaw the continued deportation and extermination of Jews and other targeted groups. The regime doubled down on its ideological war, even as its military position crumbled. The Gestapo intensified its surveillance of the civilian population, hunting for any sign of defeatism or resistance. Public executions and denunciations became tools to maintain a semblance of control amid growing chaos. In occupied territories, the effect of the July 20th backlash was also pronounced. In Poland, France, and the Balkans, the German response to partisan activity grew even more violent, with collective punishments and village massacres becoming routine. The Nazi regime viewed the coup attempt as confirmation that internal betrayal must be eradicated not only at home, but wherever German forces were stationed. Occupation policies became more repressive, undermining any hope of cooperation with local populations and fueling the determination of underground movements. Meanwhile, Allied psychological warfare operations took advantage of the Valkyrie narrative. Leaflets dropped behind German lines told of officers who had tried and failed to stop Hitler's madness, encouraging surrender and feeding doubts about the regime's legitimacy. Broadcasts from the BBC and Soviet radio repeated the story of Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators as symbols of another Germany, one that had tried to resist tyranny and had paid the ultimate price. Despite the collapse of the coup, its shadow persisted. Among surviving Wehrmacht officers, especially on the front lines, the failure of Valkyrie became a source of grim reflection. Many understood that the regime's hold had tightened not through strength, but through fear and the systematic destruction of dissent. The July 20th conspirators, once dismissed as traitors by propaganda, slowly emerged, quietly, in the thoughts of exhausted officers and civilians, as figures of tragic foresight. Their actions, however unsuccessful, had pointed to an alternative path that Germany had refused to take. Now, with the Reich surrounded on all sides and its cities in ruins, that path seemed irrevocably closed. By the beginning of 1945, Germany's military situation had become irretrievable. The Allies were closing in from both east and west, and the internal consolidation that had followed the failure of Operation Valkyrie had not translated into coherent defense. The Nazi regime, while still imposing terror on its own population and army, was effectively operating on borrowed time. Hitler's decisions grew increasingly erratic. Surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists, he refused to acknowledge military realities and issued orders detached from the actual capabilities of the Wehrmacht. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, a massive and rapid advance that brought Soviet forces to the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin, within weeks. German resistance, fragmented and demoralized, offered only token defense in many sectors. The once formidable Army Group A disintegrated under the weight of Soviet armor, artillery, and infantry, lacking reserves, fuel, and coherent command. Hitler's instructions to hold territory at all costs resulted in the encirclement and annihilation of multiple formations. The result was catastrophic civilian suffering. Entire cities depopulated, refugees streaming westward under harsh winter conditions, and mass casualties in areas caught between advancing fronts. Simultaneously in the west, the Allies pushed through the Ardennes after defeating the last major German offensive of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. This operation, launched in December 1944, had been conceived by Hitler as a way to divide the Allied front and recapture momentum. But despite initial success and heavy fighting, the offensive collapsed under Allied counterattacks and logistical exhaustion. By February 1945, the Allies had crossed the Rhine River in multiple locations. German defenses in the west were crumbling, and whole divisions were surrendering en masse. The consequences of the July 20th purge were deeply felt during these final campaigns. Many of the Wehrmacht's most competent staff officers, those who had either participated in or sympathized with the Valkyrie plot, had been executed or removed. Their replacements, often ideologically vetted but militarily inexperienced, lacked the strategic foresight or operational agility to respond effectively to encirclements or breakthroughs. Field marshals and generals who once acted with a degree of independence now waited for Hitler's personal authorization before acting, even in emergencies. This rigidity crippled German responses and accelerated the collapse of frontline coherence. At the same time, German cities became sites of extraordinary destruction. Allied strategic bombing campaigns escalated in scale and frequency. Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin were subjected to firebombing that killed tens of thousands and rendered entire urban centers uninhabitable. The civilian population faced extreme deprivation. Shortages of food, water, and medicine were widespread, and air raid shelters became semi-permanent dwellings. The SS and Gestapo intensified their repression, hunting down so-called defeatists, cowards, or anyone suspected of sympathy with the July 20th conspirators or the Allied cause. In Berlin, the Reich capital descended into a state of siege. Hitler had withdrawn permanently to the Führer bunker beneath the Reich chancellery, where he received reports that bore less and less connection to reality. His inner circle, including Goebbels, Bormann, and Himmler, remained outwardly loyal, but internally many were preparing for post-war scenarios, seeking either escape or favorable surrender terms. The legacy of the Valkyrie plot hovered in this atmosphere of denial and desperation, a reminder of a missed opportunity to prevent total ruin. The Volkssturm was now fully mobilized. Teenagers, pensioners, and wounded veterans were conscripted into makeshift battalions with little training and inadequate weapons. They were expected to resist seasoned Soviet and American forces in urban combat. These units suffered appalling casualties. Some fought with determination, driven by fear or indoctrination. Others deserted or surrendered at the first opportunity. Their deployment, far from altering the strategic picture, merely underscored the exhaustion of Germany's human resources and the regime's willingness to sacrifice its own people to prolong the inevitable. The Holocaust, far from slowing during this terminal phase, accelerated. As Soviet forces approached extermination camps in Poland, the SS undertook death marches to evacuate prisoners westward. Thousands perished from exposure, starvation, or summary execution. These forced evacuations were part of a broader policy of destruction to eliminate witnesses, preserve labor, and maintain the Nazi ideological war to the very end. Meanwhile, camps within Germany, such as Buchenwald and Dachau, remained active until the final weeks of the war, with mass killings continuing even as Allied forces advanced. Despite the terror and propaganda, signs of internal collapse became more visible. Some Wehrmacht commanders disobeyed Hitler's orders, choosing to surrender to the Western Allies rather than face annihilation or capture by the Red Army. In isolated instances, local commanders evacuated cities in defiance of scorched earth orders. Civilians increasingly ignored official proclamations, focusing on survival rather than sacrifice. Rumors about Hitler's mental state circulated widely, fueled by his visible physical decline and increasingly incoherent speeches. The disintegration of the Nazi state was no longer a theoretical outcome. It was occurring in real time, day by day, with millions of lives caught in its machinery. The July 20th conspirators had warned of this end, a devastated Germany occupied by foreign powers, its people broken and its moral foundations shattered. Their failure had ensured that the war would continue to its bitter conclusion, but their vision had not been erased. In underground sermons, whispered conversations, and scattered letters, their memory was invoked as a symbol of what might have been. As the Reich collapsed, so too did the myth of its infallibility. The cost, however, was beyond calculation. By April 1945, the Third Reich stood at the brink of total annihilation. The last phase of the war unfolded in scenes of desperate combat, political disintegration, and humanitarian catastrophe. In Berlin, Soviet forces had begun their final offensive. Encircling the capital from multiple directions, the Red Army launched one of the most intense urban battles in history. German forces, now composed largely of Volkssturm militias, remnants of shattered divisions, and foreign SS units, mounted a fanatical defense under orders to fight to the last. But the outcome was never in doubt. Soviet superiority in men, armor, and firepower ensured that the battle would end in brutal street-by-street attrition. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler remained isolated from the outside world. Surrounded by loyalists and sycophants, he refused to evacuate, still issuing commands to non-existent units and dreaming of counterattacks that would never come. His physical and mental deterioration, long speculated upon, was now unmistakable. Witnesses described him as trembling, incoherent, and obsessed with betrayal. The memory of July 20th had not faded. He frequently returned to it in rants, blaming the failed assassination for undermining morale and tainting the officer corps. The plot remained, in his eyes, proof that treason had infected the very core of the Reich. In those final days, Hitler ordered a last wave of executions. Officers, civil servants, and even family members of the Valkyrie conspirators were arrested, tortured, and shot. Some were hanged in public squares, their corpses left on display as warnings. Others, whose families had been spared until now, faced deportation or forced labor. The idea of collective punishment reached its apex. Entire bloodlines were branded as traitorous under the doctrine of Sippenhaft, kin liability. The regime's response to internal dissent had become indistinguishable from its conduct toward its foreign enemies, absolute, merciless, and total. Yet, amid this terror, signs of quiet resistance re-emerged. Local officials forged surrender documents, Wehrmacht commanders ignored orders, and countless civilians aided deserters or sheltered refugees. These were not coordinated efforts. No second Valkyrie loomed, but rather scattered acts of defiance born of exhaustion and moral clarity. In some areas, underground networks that had once supported the July 20th conspirators reactivated briefly, helping people flee westward or destroy incriminating evidence. The coup had failed, but the spirit of resistance had not entirely been extinguished. As Soviet forces advanced into Berlin, the horror of total war reached its grim conclusion. Artillery devastated entire districts. Civilian casualties mounted in the tens of thousands. Rape, looting, and execution were widespread. The remnants of the German defense, under General Helmuth Weidling, fought valiantly but hopelessly. The SS resisted until the very end, refusing any talk of surrender. Propaganda broadcasts continued until May, insisting that victory was still possible, even as the Reich crumbled above ground. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life, accompanied by his wife of one day, Eva Braun. His death was confirmed to senior officers and the Nazi leadership. In accordance with his instructions, his body was burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. The announcement of his death was made the next day, and Admiral Karl Dönitz was named as his successor, but there was no government left to govern. The Nazi regime had effectively ceased to exist. In the following days, German forces began surrendering en masse. On May 2nd, Berlin fell to the Soviets. On May 7th, Germany's unconditional surrender was signed in Reims, France, and ratified the next day in Berlin. World War II in Europe was over. The streets that had once echoed with Nazi parades now lay in ruins. Millions were dead, cities destroyed, families shattered. The cost of war, prolonged by dictatorship and the suppression of dissent, had reached an unprecedented scale. Operation Valkyrie, in retrospect, became one of the few organized efforts from within Germany to arrest this dissent. Though it failed, it had shown that resistance existed, that not all Germans had acquiesced to tyranny. The conspirators had gambled everything on the hope that Hitler's death would ignite change, bring the war to a negotiated close, and salvage what remained of the nation. Their plan had been meticulously prepared, rooted in legal frameworks, and dependent on the assumption that the military and civil service would respond rationally in the face of crisis. That assumption had proved fatal. The failure was not only operational, but cultural. The myth of obedience, the personal oath to Hitler, and the ideological indoctrination of years had created a system where even treason could appear as loyalty to the state, the people, or the fatherland. The conspirators, many of whom had served the regime before breaking from it, were ultimately too few, too late, and too isolated. Their vision of a post-Nazi Germany, constitutional, moderate, and re-engaged with the world, would not be realized until the ashes had settled. But their attempt stood as a moral statement. When the war was over and the world began to judge, the memory of July 20th would become a reference point, not for military success, but for ethical resistance. In the dark corridors of a collapsing empire, men and women had chosen to act not out of certainty, but out of conviction. They failed to change history, but they marked it. In the months following the collapse of the Third Reich, the full scope of the July 20th conspiracy and its aftermath began to emerge. As Allied occupation authorities took control of Germany, they initiated a process of political restructuring, denazification, and legal reckoning. Amid these efforts, fragments of the Valkyrie plot were recovered, documents, testimonies, and records that revealed the depth and breadth of internal German resistance. What had once been shrouded in secrecy and distorted by Nazi propaganda was now gradually reconstructed, not as a singular episode, but as a complex web of motivations, compromises, and failed ambition. Interrogations of captured German officers and officials, including those conducted during the Nuremberg trials, shed light on the inner workings of the conspiracy. Names such as Ludwig Beck, Friedrich Olbricht, Henning von Treschow and Klaus von Stauffenberg reappeared in depositions and exhibits. Prosecutors and historians alike were struck by the diversity of thought within the resistance movement. Some conspirators had been committed anti-Nazis from the early 1930s, while others had only turned against Hitler after witnessing the regime's catastrophic military decisions or crimes against humanity. Their unity had been tactical rather than ideological, with monarchists, Republicans, conservatives, and socialists temporarily setting aside their differences in the hope of halting the war and dismantling the dictatorship. The failure of Valkyrie was not only a military event, but also a failure of communication and contingency. Historians later observed that the conspirators had relied too heavily on formal hierarchies and legalistic mechanisms, assuming that if orders were issued through legitimate channels, they would be obeyed. But the psychological grip of the regime, particularly the oath of loyalty sworn to Hitler, proved stronger than anticipated. Even among officers who privately doubted the Führer's decisions, the shock of his reported death was not sufficient to spark decisive action. Many chose to wait, confirm, or report, delays that proved fatal to the operation's momentum. The role of the Reserve Army, the key instrument of Valkyrie, was especially revealing. Its activation had required speed, clarity, and total control over communication nodes. But Hitler's survival, coupled with delays in issuing commands and the hesitancy of critical figures such as General Fromm, fractured the plot's coherence. The SS and Gestapo, quick to react, began counter-operations within hours. Those military districts where conspirators were absent remained loyal to the Nazi chain of command, arresting officers who attempted to implement Valkyrie orders. In effect, the plan worked only partially, and only for a few hours, before disintegrating in confusion and fear. Within the broader context of the war, Valkyrie's failure reinforced the image of a unified Nazi Germany, even if that image was misleading. Allied leaders, who had adopted the doctrine of unconditional surrender, remained cautious about differentiating between the Nazi regime and the German nation. The conspirators' actions, though morally courageous, had come too late to alter Allied strategic calculations. Still, their existence offered a crucial counterpoint to totalitarian narratives. In the post-war period, especially in Western Europe, their story would be used to argue that not all Germans were complicit, and that resistance, however limited, had existed. Public remembrance of the conspirators evolved slowly. In the Soviet zone of occupation, and later in the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, the July 20th plotters were often dismissed as reactionary officers with no interest in democracy. Communist authorities preferred to elevate figures from the workers' resistance and communist underground. In contrast, West Germany, under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and later governments, began to rehabilitate the memory of the Valkyrie conspirators. Schools, streets, and barracks were named after Stauffenberg and his allies. Official commemorations were instituted, and documentaries and books contributed to a gradual redefinition of their legacy. Among German citizens, however, reactions remained mixed. In the immediate post-war years, many viewed the conspirators with suspicion or ambivalence. The trauma of defeat, occupation, and economic collapse made it difficult to confront questions of guilt, complicity, and resistance. Some saw the plotters as elitists who had acted only when the war was lost. Others criticized their failure to coordinate with civilian resistance groups or to reach out to broader segments of the population. Yet, as time passed and the Federal Republic stabilized, the memory of July 20th began to serve as a moral anchor, evidence that conscience had survived even under dictatorship. For the surviving family members of the conspirators, the post-war years were marked by both recognition and lingering hardship. Many had lost not only loved ones, but also property, careers, and social standing. Rehabilitation was not immediate. It took years for some widows and children to receive pensions or have their relatives' actions officially recognized as honorable. But through their perseverance, they helped preserve the memory of the resistance and its ideals. Organizations such as the Stiftung 20. Juli von 1944, July 20th, 1944 Foundation, were established to educate future generations and maintain historical documentation. Operation Valkyrie ultimately failed to achieve its immediate objectives. It did not kill Hitler, did not overthrow the regime, and did not prevent the destruction of Germany. Yet its symbolic power endured. It demonstrated that within the machinery of tyranny, there were those willing to risk everything to stop it. The conspirators' actions, while flawed and fragmented, revealed the limits of obedience and the possibility of moral agency even in the darkest circumstances. Their legacy would continue to grow, not only in Germany, but internationally, as an example of the complex calculus of resistance, how to act when legality has been co-opted, when institutions serve injustice, and when the price of conscience is death. The men and women of July 20th made that choice, and in doing so, they left behind not only a failed plot, but a profound historical statement. In the decades that followed the end of World War II, Operation Valkyrie and its central figures gradually transitioned from the shadows of failed insurrection to the foreground of historical inquiry and national reflection. What had once been considered treason under the Nazi regime was reassessed in the light of post-war democratic values. Historians, legal scholars, and educators began the long process of unraveling the mythologies that had surrounded both the conspirators and the state they tried to overthrow. This process revealed not only the operational dimensions of the plot, but also the philosophical, religious, and ethical convictions that motivated its participants. A central question emerged in the historiography of the July 20th plot. How representative were the conspirators of broader German society? The answer was complex. Most of the key figures were from the military aristocracy or civil service elite, individuals with long-standing ties to the traditional structures of the German state. Their opposition to Hitler was, in many cases, rooted not in early resistance to National Socialism, but in their disillusionment with the regime's conduct of the war and its departure from conservative values of honor and order. This led some post-war critics to argue that their motives were too narrow, too self-preserving, and too late. Yet such critiques often overlooked the personal risks they undertook, and the clarity with which many of them came to see the full moral catastrophe of Nazism. Figures like Helmuth James von Moltke, a legal theorist and member of the Kreisau Circle, represented a strand of resistance that fused Christian ethics, human rights, and constitutional principles. Others, such as Henning von Treschow, came to view the war in the East and the Holocaust not merely as strategic errors, but as crimes that demanded decisive action regardless of outcome. These men and their associates did not expect to survive. Many wrote farewell letters in the days before the attempt, conscious that their actions would likely end in failure and death. The historiographical reassessment of Valkyrie also led to broader inquiries into the nature of resistance under totalitarian regimes. Scholars examined how the regime's surveillance state, propaganda apparatus, and monopoly on violence had effectively neutralized organized opposition. They studied the psychological mechanisms that induced conformity, the role of personal oaths to Hitler, and the social dynamics that discouraged dissent even among those who privately opposed the regime. Against this backdrop, the July 20th plot appeared not as a missed opportunity, but as a rare rupture in the machinery of obedience. In West Germany, as democratic institutions matured and a new generation came of age, interest in the resistance grew, memorials were erected, and the story of Valkyrie entered public education. The Bendler block, where Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators were executed, was converted into a memorial site, and now houses the German Resistance Memorial Center. Every July 20th, German leaders lay wreaths and deliver speeches honoring the courage of those who defied tyranny. These ceremonies reflect not only respect for the individuals involved, but also a commitment to the principle that there is a moral imperative to resist injustice, even at the cost of one's life. This evolution of memory was not uniform. In East Germany, the regime's Marxist-Leninist ideology viewed the July 20th plot with suspicion, emphasizing instead communist-led resistance. The conspirators were dismissed as reactionary militarists who sought to preserve pre-war class structures. It wasn't until German reunification in 1990 that a more integrated national narrative emerged, one that acknowledged the plurality of resistance efforts, including conservative, religious, and socialist strands. Internationally, the legacy of Operation Valkyrie gained renewed visibility in the 21st century, particularly through cultural representations. Films, books, and documentaries brought the story to global audiences. The 2008 film Valkyrie, starring Tom Cruise as Stauffenberg, sparked renewed debate within Germany about the accuracy and meaning of the events portrayed. While dramatized, such works helped introduce the broader public to the moral complexities and personal sacrifices involved in the conspiracy. They underscored that historical memory is not static. It evolves as societies renegotiate their relationships with the past. Importantly, the legacy of Valkyrie extended beyond historical interpretation to legal and constitutional thinking. The conspirators' reliance on constitutional legality, military protocols, and the structures of state authority, even as they plotted a coup, reflected a desire to restore lawful governance rather than impose a new dictatorship. Post-war Germany's basic law, Grundgesetz, would echo some of these principles, embedding protections for human dignity, checks on executive power, and the right to resist unlawful authority. The enduring relevance of July the 20th lies in its challenge to simplistic narratives. The conspirators were neither saints nor flawless democrats. Their backgrounds, beliefs, and motivations were varied, but within the context of a genocidal regime that demanded total allegiance, they chose to act when inaction had become complicity. Their decision to risk everything, not for personal gain, but in the hope of salvaging their nation's moral core, stands as one of the most significant acts of conscience in modern European history. As Germany and the world continue to confront new threats to democracy, rule of law, and human rights, the memory of Operation Valkyrie offers not answers, but questions. What does loyalty mean under tyranny? When does duty become complicity? And what does resistance require, not only in acts of defiance, but in the courage to imagine a different future, even when it seems out of reach? Today, Operation Valkyrie stands as one of the most thoroughly examined, commemorated, and symbolically charged episodes in the history of modern Germany. Its narrative has shifted from one of isolated military insubordination to a broader moral reckoning, a focal point in the national dialogue on guilt, conscience, and historical responsibility. The failed attempt to assassinate Hitler on July the 20th, 1944, has become more than a tale of a conspiracy. It is now a prism through which the ethical dimensions of resistance, obedience, and civic duty are constantly reevaluated. The Bendler Block courtyard, where Stauffenberg and his fellow officers were executed by firing squad, has become the epicenter of this memory. Each year, state officials, veterans, school groups, and international dignitaries gather there to pay tribute. The ceremonies are solemn, deliberately understated, emphasizing reflection over spectacle. In speeches delivered by German presidents and chancellors, July the 20th is often invoked as a moment when a few stood against many, guided not by the certainty of success, but by the imperative of conscience. Their choice, made in defiance of absolute power, now underpins Germany's post-war identity as a democratic and pluralistic state. Yet the process of memorialization has never been uncontested. For years after the war, public opinion toward the conspirators was divided. Some saw them as heroes, others as traitors. The Wehrmacht's institutional culture, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, was slow to fully embrace the legacy of July 20th. The professional military class, wary of coups and politically sensitive to narratives of betrayal, preferred a cautious distance. Only with generational change and sustained historical scholarship did this hesitation begin to recede. By the 1980s and 90s, the names of Stauffenberg, Beck, and others were more widely acknowledged as symbols of moral courage within the Bundeswehr and civil society. In education, Valkyrie became a cornerstone of civic instruction. German students learned not only about the plot itself, but about the broader conditions that enabled and constrained resistance. The story serves as an entry point into discussions about the fragility of democratic institutions, the manipulation of legal authority, and the responsibilities of individuals under authoritarian rule. It encourages students to question authority, understand the weight of ethical decisions, and reflect on the historical contingencies that shape human action. The international perception of Operation Valkyrie has also evolved. In Europe, North America, and beyond, the plot is frequently cited in discussions of resistance movements, civil disobedience, and the struggle against totalitarianism. It appears in textbooks, museums, and leadership training programs, often as a case study in the limits of power and the costs of moral action. For survivors of similar regimes, whether in Latin America, Eastern Europe, or parts of Asia, the story resonates as both a warning and an inspiration. In cultural memory, Valkyrie's symbols have transcended their historical origins. The black and white photograph of Klaus von Stauffenberg, his eye patch and wounded hand visible, has become an icon of defiant humanity. Letters written by the conspirators, especially their final farewells to wives, children, and friends, are now preserved and displayed as testimonies to ethical clarity under duress. In these texts, one hears neither self-pity nor despair, but a resolute understanding that to act was necessary, even if doomed. Yet, Valkyrie's legacy is not confined to the past. In a world where authoritarianism has resurged in various forms, where democratic institutions are tested by extremism, polarization, and propaganda, the lessons of July 20th remain uncomfortably relevant. The conspirators' dilemma, whether and how to resist a criminal regime from within, echoes in contemporary debates about whistleblowing, institutional complicity, and the moral limits of obedience. Their story reminds us that even the most meticulously constructed systems of control cannot completely extinguish individual agency. Crucially, the conspirators of Valkyrie did not act as isolated heroes. They depended on networks of trust, shared values, and collective planning. Their failure, while devastating, was not the failure of principle. It was the consequence of timing, miscommunication, and the immense weight of institutional inertia. They did not succeed in changing the course of the war, but they did succeed in altering the moral topography of their country's history. In doing so, they carved a space for future generations to engage with questions of duty, sacrifice, and the price of silence. Today, their names are not only carved into stone, but woven into the conscience of a nation that has chosen remembrance over denial. Operation Valkyrie endures not because it succeeded, but because it dared to exist at all. Because in the face of tyranny, a group of individuals chose to act. And in that act, they left behind something far greater than they could have imagined. A testament to the enduring power of moral courage in the darkest of times.